This is Democracy,
a podcast about the people of the United States.
A podcast about citizenship,
about engaging with politics and the world around you.
A podcast about educating yourself on today's important issues
and how to have a voice in what happens next.
Welcome to our new episode of This is Democracy. This week, we are moving away from our multi-week discussion of Civil War by other means and coming back to a series of issues that bring the history of our international society together with contemporary affairs, and no issue does this more directly and more tragically than the current war in Ukraine. We're fortunate to be joined again by our good friend and really someone who already was a leading scholar of Russia and U.S. affairs and European affairs before the war, but is now catapulted, I think, to one of the leading public intellectuals on the topic, our good friend, Dr. Michael Kimmage. Michael, thank you for joining us again.
It's so wonderful to be back with the two of you.
Michael Kimmage is a professor of history at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. He's also a fellow at the German Marshall Fund and chair of the advisory council for the Kennan Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. He served on the policy planning staff of the Department of State from 2014 to 2017, and he held the Russia-Ukraine portfolio for the policy planning staff in that role. He publishes widely on international affairs, U.S. Russian relations, intellectual and diplomatic history, written a number of books that we've mentioned before. The one I'll just highlight now, which seems particularly relevant, The Abandonment of the West, The History of an Idea in American Foreign Policy. And Michael has been remarkably prolific in the last few months, writing more than a dozen major pieces in foreign affairs and other places, other major publications in the United States and overseas, putting the war in Ukraine in historical perspective. So we're really fortunate to have Michael with us today. Before we turn to our discussion with Michael Kimmage, we have, of course, Mr. Zachary's poem. What is the title of your poem today?
A Fragmentary Illusion.
I can't wait to hear this one. Let's hear it.
When the bomb fell, they were walking in the park, and when the fire started, they were opening their frosted-over windows to greet the morning as if it were a bluebird on a branch a few feet away. A few feet away, they were, the children, dancing in little circles down the avenue, reading off words like they were fragments in some grand mosaic, and bread, delivery, recruitment were needed, necessary, if only to see some bigger, less fragmentary illusion. Illusions, the light was dancing on the blue-green windows. Illusions, the roads seemed to bend, and the voices suddenly, illusions, dissipate into a general groaning. Eventually, we will all be groaning. Eventually, we are all alone, and we find ourselves, like them, grave at the river's edge, an unremembered, unrecognizable individual.
Zachary, that really evokes so many emotions. What is your poem about?
My poem is really about the conflict between the individual experience of war and the dehumanization that comes with such widespread violence and the terror such that Putin has been imposing on the people of Kyiv and other parts of Ukraine in recent days. And the real horror, not just in its physical toll on the population, but also in its dehumanization.
Right. Well, Michael, that's a sad place to start, but probably the appropriate place to start in talking about the war, right?
That's correct. Yeah, I believe it's the 8th month of the war, probably approaching the 9th month, and exactly as Zachary illustrates in his beautiful poem, I mean, the humanitarian toll remains astonishingly high, and the recent development of targeted attacks on Ukraine's electrical grid and civilian infrastructure, which have been ongoing since the beginning of the war, but have intensified in the last couple of weeks, really again underscore the immense humanitarian price that the Ukrainians are paying for this needless and criminal war.
Michael, with the perspective of 8 to 9 months now, following things as closely as you are, with the historical knowledge you have, what do you think this war is about? What is driving the not just Vladimir Putin, but primarily Vladimir Putin and the other actors in this war?
Well, I think Putin is difficult to characterize at the present moment. I think that he has, because the war has not gone well for Russia, has changed to a degree in his ambitions, not his ultimate ambitions, which remain, I think, in a sense, simple. He wishes to control the destiny of Ukraine, and through control of the destiny of Ukraine, he wishes to rewrite the rules of European security and European order. And those are, in his view, grand ambitions, and I don't think he's given up on those grand ambitions, but they seemed perhaps tantalizingly within reach in the first couple of days of the war for Putin, and they've really receded further and further from view for him. So, I think his tangible ambition at the present moment is just to kind of hold on through the winter and see if he can draw this war out and extend it, and if the other side will start to crack. But sort of a broader view of victory for Putin, I think, is very, very hard to identify at the moment. I sort of feel from Putin's side or from Russia's side that the war is entering into a nihilistic phase, that it's not really determined by victory anymore. It's difficult to say what victory might mean under the circumstances, but the will to inflict suffering is still very great, and in a sense to deprive Ukraine of any kind of victory, or to deprive Ukraine's Western supporters of any kind of victory. But it's gone from a positive set of ambitions in the sense that there was an order Putin wished to create, to a negative set of ambitions, so the worst case scenarios that he's trying to forestall. That's, one half of the crisis. For Ukraine, I don't think that the war is complicated to characterize either. In a sense, it's a very different trajectory for Ukraine. It was utterly existential for the first couple of weeks and months. I do think that we can say with confidence that Ukraine will hold, and Kiev will be its capital, and Zelensky's government will stay in place, absolutely, for the foreseeable future, or simply for the future, which is a kind of astonishing victory for Ukraine. But the struggle for survival is still absolutely ongoing and absolutely unfinished. And in that sense, Ukraine has achieved a great deal, but the road ahead of it is going to be long. I think it's for the third side of the conflict, which is the Western and international global supporters of Ukraine, where in some respects the war is most difficult to characterize. It's about support for Ukraine. It's about keeping Ukrainian sovereignty and independence, as the Biden administration continues coherently to affirm. But beyond that, the kind of goals of the war are a little bit nebulous. So Russia is struggling not to lose. Ukraine is going to struggle to hold on to all that it's achieved over the last 8-9 months, and the Western supporters are going to be there behind Ukraine, but I think with a little bit less of a strong story to tell.
And with the benefit of whatever 8 months of hindsight can provide, why do you think it was that the Ukrainians were able to resist what many, including us three, on February 24th, predicted would be a very swift Ukrainian defeat?
Yes, I mean it's an excellent question, and it's very nice to be reminded of that conversation that we had at the beginning of this whole nightmare, and to be reminded that for the three of us who, from the very beginning, were completely sympathetic with the Ukrainian cause, that we underestimated several of the capacities that have shown themselves in spades over the last couple of months in Ukraine. So I think that you can answer the question really from two vantage points, and most important is to start with Ukraine, that it's a country of considerable size, roughly the size of Texas, and a population a bit under 40 million, that has always had a sort of proverbial about Ukraine that there are regional, ethnic, linguistic, and religious differences within Ukraine, and that had been one source of skepticism about whether it could pull through with a war. But Ukrainians have resolved that problem. I don't think that that's an issue at this stage. It's not that the differences have gone away, but they're in no sense an obstacle to the kind of national unity that's necessary at wartime. Secondly, for the Ukrainians, the military that they have is one that's quite a lot better than it was in 2014. That's sort of better integrated, better run, better equipped than it was when Russia took Crimea and handed Ukraine a couple of defeats in the summer and winter of 2014, 2015. And in addition to a high quality military, Ukrainian decision-making has, I think, been extremely sound. The ways in which the Russians were repelled around Kiev and in the north in the first couple of months, how Ukraine withstood the war of attrition that Russia was imposing on it in the summer, with seemingly some success on the Russian side, but that was endured. And then, of course, as we've all been watching since the 10th of September, the extraordinary counteroffensive, which has been a strategic success and also indicates how well the Ukrainian military has absorbed U.S. and other kinds of advanced military assistance that's been coming to Ukraine and has been very, very successfully integrated. So national unity, successful political and military leadership, and high morale and success on the battlefield, that's been the recipe on the Ukrainian side. And I think you see a lot of the virtues that Ukraine has demonstrated sort of mirrored in Russian vices over the last couple of months. So a lunatic concept of operations for Russia, far too ambitious for Russian capacities, political goals that Putin can describe in the Kremlin, but that don't speak very urgently to a lot of Russian soldiers who don't know what they're doing in Ukraine, and a sort of consistent for Russia catastrophic underestimation of Ukraine, that they failed to see how Russia could even lose around Kiev, and yet Russia did, and then they learned very few lessons from that, and were completely ill-prepared for the counteroffensive around Kharkiv and have been struggling further to the south in Kherson. So sort of hubris, lack of organization, really a lack of purpose, I would say, in the war. Not that Putin hasn't given it a rhetorical purpose, but a lack of a purpose that rings true. And then finally, a kind of discombobulation on the battlefield that I think has been a surprise to almost all observers. In a sense, everybody had too robust an image of Russia's battlefield capacities, and they've shown themselves to be a middling army when it comes to conventional war.
You mentioned earlier perhaps the three major players whose perspectives we need to take into account here: the Western and other powers supporting Ukraine, and the Kremlin. But what of the Russian people? We've seen in recent weeks a number of stories in the American press on Russian resistance to military conscription. Could that this sort of resistance to the Kremlin's narrative in Russia at home play a role in the war, perhaps moving forward?
It will, and it can. But here, I would just urge sobriety. It will sound like pessimism. I hope it's more sobriety, that Russia has nothing resembling an anti-war movement, and has not had one since the very first days of the war, where there were sporadic protests in a handful of Russian cities. And by an anti-war movement, I mean something that has organization, that has a kind of plan, either some method of influencing people in the Kremlin, or of perhaps putting in jeopardy the Kremlin's rule or the Kremlin's power. There are such instances in Russian history, going back, say, to the First World War, where the Tsar's power started to weaken and then was eventually eviscerated by wartime protest. But that's just not the story so far in Russia. What you've seen is certainly lots of resistance to mobilization, in the sense that most young Russian men seem not to want to go to war, and so they've done things to evade the draft, or they've left the country. What you've seen, according to polling data in the last couple of weeks and months, is a lot of anxiety in Russia about the war. That's a new factor, but you have not seen this coalesce into an anti-war movement. And if you trust the polling data, which I kind of have to, it was a popular war up until, say, July, August, but it's still not an unpopular war in Russia. And my personal conviction is that Russians look at the war, wish it wasn't there, wish it wasn't happening, but don't want to lose it. And to that degree, Putin has the support of the Russian population. But it's early days for a war that I suspect is going to be quite long. And if Putin would be prudent, he is apparently, in his own description, a great student of history. If he would be prudent, he would study the history of long, poorly articulated wars of attrition, and he might see some very, very worrying signs already within Russia, but worrying signs in terms of what could happen a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now. So yes, disorganization, chaos, I think a lot of discontent under the surface and behind closed doors, but in public, alas, an absent or non-existent anti-war movement.
So, Michael, as I was listening to your really evocative description of the situation in Russia today, it does seem to me it echoes, as I think you implied, the circumstances in Russia perhaps in 1915 or 1916, when there wasn't an anti-war movement as we think of it in the United States, but there clearly was a restiveness and a discombobulation of society that contributed through discontent to the undermining of a regime. And shouldn't Putin be conscious of that, and should that have some effect on him?
He should. I mean, it's a very good analogy, very telling analogy. In fact, in 1913, a year before the First World War begins, you have I think it's 1913, but roughly then you have the 300th anniversary of the Romanov dynasty, which is celebrated with great enthusiasm across Russia, all different orders of and classes of society. So if you would draw your conclusions from that moment, you would say that the Romanov dynasty had another 300 years in it, circa 1913. Of course, 1915, summer of 1915, is the apex of the war on the Eastern Front for Russia, where Tsar Nicholas II speaks in the Polish city of Przemysl, which is now a staging ground for the war in Ukraine. So 1915, there's almost a kind of euphoria about the war in Russia, and then those 2 years that follow, there's a very, very precipitous decline. I think that the one salient difference, in addition to just how huge the First World War was and how devastating for the population of Russia overall, which the Ukraine war so far hasn't been, I think the one salient difference is that you have 20 years before the revolution, 30 years before the revolution, a long legacy of political violence. It's really Russia that innovates the modern practice of sort of political terror with assassinations. And I think it was thousands of Tsarist officials who were assassinated in those years. And, of course, Bolshevik and other revolutionary movements that are, sort of operating within Russia and have the Tsar as a target. And that's, not been the case for Putin. He's sort of presided over, in a sense, more stable or peaceful times. So there's not a revolutionary movement waiting in the wings at the moment as there was then. But, one has to be careful with those kinds of judgments, because especially in the dictatorship that Russia overtly is now, and, probably has been for several years, but very emphatically is now, there's a lot that's invisible. So there really may be revolutionary sentiment, but it's possible that we can't see it. But I think that the basic fact is that a war is a pressure point. An unjust and criminal war is an additional pressure point, and then a war that Russia may well be losing is an even greater pressure point. And whether Putin has the capacities to navigate himself toward a ceasefire, or to navigate himself out of this war, or to navigate himself through this catastrophic war, it really remains to be seen. And it's possible that he does not have those capacities.
Right, and it's also possible he might overcompensate and come to the conclusion that the Tsar was too weak. And you're referring to the assassinations undertaken by SRs and others. Of course, you could argue now Putin's been the one doing the assassinating of people, right?
Right. Exactly. There is political violence, but it comes from the state.
Right, not against the state. How do you think about the on-again, off-again nuclear threats that come from Putin?
I'll offer you an argument that I think is clear, and I think also reassuring, and I hope that it's true. I think that the value of the nuclear threat for Putin is the value that it has in terms of instilling fear, and he's done a good job in the last couple of weeks getting headlines about this. And just today at the Valdai conference, a sort of international affairs conference in Russia, was making jokes about nuclear war. And sort of bringing it back onto the agenda. And of course, when he does that, he forces everybody to take note of this circumstance that Russia is a nuclear power, and kind of madman theory type behavior from Putin at the moment. And I think that his goal, his most effective goal, or sort of efficient goal with this, is to sow division within the body politic of perhaps the United States, but especially of Germany, where you have a sort of pacifist sensibility and lots of concern and anxiety about nuclear questions. So there, I think it really has a kind of utility for Putin. You just sort of keep the pressure on a low boil, keep people speculating. And I think journalists have a very hard time resisting any kind of statement that Putin issues about nuclear war. I'm not saying that it should be swept under the carpet, but it's sort of good copy. This kind of stuff, and it's it's a way of changing the conversation from Russia's battlefield defeats of the last 2 months and putting it on a different footing and one that's more politically useful for Putin. I do not, insofar as I understand these things, I don't see great military utility in Putin using nuclear weapons, in the sense that I don't think it would win him the war. There is, I think, a very important difference between Hiroshima and Nagasaki and nuclear weapons that Putin might use, which is that in the summer of 1945, Japan was losing the war. And in a sense, nuclear weapons finished the deal. And at the moment, Ukraine is winning the war. And so I think it's the likelihood that Ukraine would surrender or sort of give up because of nuclear weapons use is very low. And then there's the demonstration effect that nuclear weapons have, but it seems there that Putin probably would lose more than he would gain if he were to put these weapons into practice. And the point has been made, sort of often, that countries like India or Brazil that are fence-sitters at the moment might get off the fence, and even China, which has thrown in its lot behind Russia to a degree with this war, that even China might change course were Putin to use nuclear weapons. So I think the threat has a lot of value for him. I think the use of the weapons themselves is pretty unlikely. The only way in which I think it might become likely is if Russia were rapidly to lose, perhaps in the vicinity of Crimea, or if a kind of escalation would occur by accident, which is hopefully not going to happen, but maybe a remote possibility.
And I think that makes a lot of sense, and it is a little reassuring, we should say, not a source of complacency in any way. How do you think about the role of our European allies as this war emerges and as we get into winter? It does seem one of the things Putin is counting on is that the pressure on the Europeans will be greater, both from the greater energy needs they'll have this winter and from rising prices, and the Saudis have certainly contributed to that by reducing production of oil in this period.
So one thing that I think the Europeans are not going to do, and I think this speaks to mistakes that Putin has made regarding Europe, is that they're not going to go back. So it's very true that Europe is already suffering from inflation and all of the costs that come with high energy prices. And I guess you could say, if you wanted to be very simplistic, that the magic bullet would be to sue for peace in Ukraine and sort of get Russia to resupply, the gas and the oil, especially the gas. But, I think that Russia has shown itself to be so untrustworthy that would be a pretty crazy argument for Europeans to embrace. And I think that they're not going to embrace it. It's as if they've crossed that bridge, they've sort of crossed that Rubicon, and there really isn't a way of going back to the status quo ante. So I just don't think that European countries are going to link sanctions policy or start exerting pressure on Ukraine in such a way as to sort of bring the war to a quicker termination because of all the things that you're describing. But having been reassuring on the nuclear question, let me try not to be too Pollyanna-ish on this particular question. I think it's the way I see it, it's more as a set of variables that are going to bring increasing instability to Europe. In terms of Europe's domestic politics. I mean, we saw this in 2015 with the Syrian civil war and the migrant crisis that it generated, that it did, for example, in Germany, create a new kind of popularity for the AfD, for that far-right political movement. AfD has been creeping up a little bit in some of the more recent German elections. And so it's not as if Europe per se is going to change course. I don't think in the next 12 months that's going to happen. But will enough of these variables coalesce to sort of diminish the consensus, to foster polarization, maybe to make Europe as a whole less functional and therefore less able to prosecute the war, to contribute to Ukraine's success through financial and military means? And in that sense, could the kind of Western coalition be degraded? But let me just throw in one further point here, that the U.S. plays a pretty important role in all of this. And I don't think that Europe is going to break from sanctions or from support for Ukraine if the United States is robustly in favor of these things. It's not as if the U.S. calls the shots in Europe, but I just think that if you have strong support from the U.S., it would be quite hard for Europe to go in a very, very different direction. So I think for the next 12 months, we'll see a kind of policy continuity. If Europe has to go through a second winter of energy crisis, then maybe you could say all bets are off. But 12 months is a long enough time in politics.
Well, and it seems to be shaping up for a pretty warm winter so far in lots of Europe.
It's been a warm fall, yeah.
Yeah, well, let's hope so. Let's hope, though it's hard to know what to hope for with climate change. Right? I mean, so I don't know what I'm supposed to hope for, colder or warmer weather. I don't know. I just want non-extreme weather. Let's put it that way. So Michael, the question that puzzles me the most is how Ukraine should strategize going forward, and maybe we can talk about that. You've spent a lot of time, I know, thinking about the Ukrainian position in all of this, and it's clear, as you said, that they've done so much better than so many of us expected, and they are winning the war. I think those are just undeniable facts, but that doesn't mean they will win the war. Where should they go from here?
It's not an easy question to answer. The tragedy of Ukraine's position is that Russia is, after all, a nuclear power. It is the case that Russia has a population of 140 million people, and however badly Russia has done militarily over the last 8 months, it's not a military lightweight, and it does have, if it's able to sustain this war effort over a 2-3 year time period, it does have the chance to reconstitute itself. And if Putin stays in power, which he may, those ambitions are going to stay in place. The ambitions of taking Kiev, of toppling the Ukrainian government, of trying to exert considerable Russian control, at least over, sort of half of Ukraine or a portion of Ukraine. So that, in a sense, is part of the landscape for Ukraine, in the way that the Alps are part of the landscape for Switzerland. You can't get rid of that set of circumstances, and I don't think that Ukraine can bet on Putin falling and a benign Russian president, pro-Ukrainian, pro-Western Russian president coming to power. That's betting on 1,000 to 1 odds of something happening, and you just can't base your security on that foundation. I think that Ukraine has to be very careful about keeping its alliances with the U.S., alliances with the U.S., with Western Europe. I think Eastern Europe is going to be just very firmly in Ukraine's camp, forever. So that's not something that Ukraine really has to work on so much. But certainly with the U.S. and Western Europe, that support is crucial. So there it needs to just be clever diplomatically and continue using the kinds of narrative devices, social media devices that Zelensky has so effectively used. And then I think there will be a need in the future, maybe a year from now, maybe 2 years from now, not for peace with Russia, but perhaps for a version of a ceasefire that Ukraine can then back up with real deterrent tools. With, of course, the help of the U.S. and with other outside powers. So it's not that you're depending on Putin's good faith to keep the peace, but that you can hopefully put an end to the worst of the fighting. Along which territorial lines, I don't know. We can say going back to pre-February 24th, I suspect that's probably on the optimistic side. But, if it's that, if it's less than that, if it's more than that, that, is up for determination. A kind of line of contact, a 75% ceasefire perhaps, and then really, really robust efforts at deterrence that would make it hard for Russia to act on the will that it will retain to reinvade. And, we could go on to the economic questions from here, but let me leave it at that. But I think it will be a semi-peace enforced by deterrence that will not resolve the problem, but put an end to the worst of the fighting.
And what about the sort of maybe the factor that's most up in the air at the moment, which is the American political climate around Ukraine? There's been a lot of talk lately of what a Republican-controlled House of Representatives or Congress entirely would change about American policy towards Ukraine. Do you think there's a risk that Ukraine loses in some significant sense support from the United States?
I don't think it risks losing support from the United States. I mean, it does feel to me like the Biden administration has been hurrying to get a lot of assistance over to Ukraine before the midterms. So they are perhaps worried about something, and I would take that quite seriously. Congress is a co-equal branch of government, and in theory, could try to wind down the war. But that to me seems a lot more than what Republicans would attempt to do if they would take the House, or if they would take the House and the Senate. They may get in the way. They may slow things down. They may make that money harder to come by. Maybe worst case scenarios, they would start impeachment proceedings or congressional investigations related to the war that could muddy the waters and just make it more difficult to argue for in the public sphere. All of that is possible, but I just don't think that Congress is going to impose a change of course on American foreign policy with this issue, and I don't think the White House is going to be persuaded by Congress to change course itself. So there could be tweaks, there could be diminishments to the policy, but I think the policy is going to stay long past the midterm elections, and in that sense, I think 2024 will be the sort of test case. If I were sort of in the Biden administration at the moment, instead of looking at the midterms with fear, or looking at the Republican Party with fear in this regard, I think that they should look at it as an opportunity to just continuously reconnect with voters, with constituents, with the American people, and continue to win the argument. The arguments that the administration has are very good, and it has a considerable track record at the moment over the last 8 months. So just keep driving that home, keep sort of engaging in the debate. In some ways, a bit of skepticism or questioning from Congress can be a good thing. I frankly was happy to see congressional Democrats put out a letter a couple of days ago challenging Biden administration policy. They retracted it. It was a foolish letter. It was very badly timed. It didn't present I think a persuasive counter argument, but that's why I was happy about it. There should be a debate. That's what Congress should be doing. You don't want a rubber stamp of the kind that we had after 9/11. Let the chips fall where they may, sort of put the questions out there, and then give the Biden administration the opportunity to answer them effectively. So, it's not what the administration fails to see. I think that they see that, but they should really be directing their attention internally on these matters. There is probably a bit of Ukraine fatigue in the American population. I think that there will be questions coming up about why the U.S. is doing so much, and in a sense, comparatively, Europe is doing so little. And those issues are going to have to be dealt with and managed. So that's, I think, how ideally the sort of Republican skepticism could be converted into just a more firmly grounded policy for the White House.
Well, and it does seem an area, Michael, where there is an opportunity to build bridges between some Democrats and Republicans on this issue. Not all Republicans and not all Democrats, but it does seem that this is an area where one could see effective partnerships across the aisle.
Yeah, certainly with Mitch McConnell, so whose statements, over the last couple of days have been, very robustly in support of Ukraine, and I'm, sort of less versed in other figures, but you see how a candidate like J.D. Vance has been sort of struggling on this issue. That he wants to take a kind of, what the best description would be for it, but a kind of populist, Ukraine skeptical line. He wants to, and he sort of sent up a couple of trial balloons, and it seems not to have worked that well.
Right.
In Ohio, that's not material for coalitions in the White House, but it is interesting that the kind of, maybe it's a stereotype, but the sort of neo-Trumpian, pro-Russian, or sort of skeptical politician about Ukraine, that they seem not to have very good recipes for connecting with voters and getting their message across, and that may be helpful in terms of finding other Republicans who are much more in line with the Biden arguments about Ukraine.
Right. So Michael, to sort of bring all of this detail together, you've given us really such a powerful and well-informed perspective on so many dimensions of this very multidimensional conflict. Is it safe to say really what this is a war of attrition that we're in, that is not going to end anytime soon, and where there's unlikely to be major shifts militarily or politically in the near future?
I'm not entirely sure, getting a bit outside of my own actual expertise, but I think that what the 10th of September, the Ukrainian counteroffensive around Kharkiv, showed is that what threatened to become a classic war of attrition over the summer could pretty quickly shift into something else. And again, the integration of HIMARS and other precision, sort of missiles and other kinds of weapons by Ukraine has given them a kind of momentum, I think, that was surprising even to them, and certainly very surprising to the Russians. Now, granted, Kherson has not been a cakewalk by any means. It's been very costly for the Ukrainian military. But there too, you could imagine that Kherson could fall to Ukraine, and in that sense, the war might take on new dimensions. I mean, I think that there was maybe a bit of over-optimism in September. People thought that Ukraine could kind of punch through the land bridge or maybe retake Mariupol, and that looks pretty remote at the moment. But I think, there are some pretty considerable shifts that could happen even over the winter. It's not, I think, guaranteed that the fighting will cease. I think the next couple of weeks are going to be pretty muddy and wet in Ukraine, so you might see a very slow pace then, but it could come back. Of course, we need to remember that the war itself began in the third week of February, so it was a winter war at the outset, and it may be a winter war in the next couple of months. And I say with less, I say with no enthusiasm at all, but we have a social media conversation about Russia's mobilization that's a little bit like the social media war, very much filtered through certain lenses, and we've seen the incompetence and Russians running away and people who don't have enough equipment and all of that. But mobilization over time will get rationalized, and if it is 300,000 additional soldiers that Russia has brought on board, that too could make it something other than a war of attrition. But that would be a spring-summer dynamic next year. So yes, it has many of those aspects of a war of attrition. Certainly, if we look at the global dimensions, we have the kind of Russia bloc and the Ukraine West bloc, and they're sort of trying to outduel each other through economics, not through military means. But on the battlefields, it could be, sort of fluid and dynamic, certainly for the next couple of months.
And that anticipated my final question for you. And you already spoke a bit about this, but I wanted to really put a fine point on it. If you were advising the Biden administration now, would you advise the administration to try to support a breakthrough for Ukraine, or to bet on time? Is time in our favor or not?
I think betting on time to me makes more sense. If they can achieve a breakthrough, Godspeed. But I don't think that there's any achievable breakthrough that Ukraine can get to in the next couple of weeks or months that would fundamentally alter the war. And in that sense, the war is not going to be resolved probably by a breakthrough. It's going to be real resolve and patience on the Ukrainian side, certainly on the side of Ukraine's supporters, that's going to matter. And in that sense, the costs of the war as they begin to mount in Russia could well be a factor and could start to alter the dynamic. I think that the hardest task now for the Biden administration, and maybe they're there in private, I don't see evidence of this in public, but the hardest task for the Biden administration is to figure out the place where this can, sort of finish up acceptably. And, obviously the administration has repeated many times that it's the Ukrainians who are going to decide this. That makes a lot of sense, but it can't be up in the air forever. It's too soon to decide now. It's too soon to give it that sort of shape. But I think there's a way in which the story of the war and the end phase of the war are going to have to be brought together. My gravest concern about the war on our side is not the Republican Party, and it's not even the, sort of the economic fallout of the war. It's that we'll lose the storyline. We'll sort of lose the narrative. We've maybe pumped up a little bit too much of this Hollywood narrative about Zelensky, that he's the Churchill and he's sort of destined to win the day. I hope it's true, but it may not feel that way for a long time to come. And if not, we're going to need a story to tell about this war that's going to keep our populations behind it. And that story is going to have something to do with how the war ends. So if I knew all the answers in this regard, I would write it up for Foreign Affairs and put it out in public and sort of say what the answer is. I don't know what the answer is in this regard, but this is where the Biden administration has to move. They've done brilliantly with military support for Ukraine, really brilliantly. And I think one only begins to see now through newspaper articles. There's a long New Yorker article about weapons provision to Ukraine, just sort of the scale of the effort and the intelligence behind it, and intelligence sharing and targeting, and it's been splendid. But it's half the necessary effort for the successful prosecution of this war. And I think the really difficult decisions, and they will be difficult, there will be some degree of compromise that's probably going to be necessary on the ground. Ukraine is not going to get everything it wants in terms of war crimes tribunals and reparations and territory, and sort of figuring out where that compromise is going to be acceptable is going to be enormously difficult. But if we only defer there, and we're not willing to sort of contemplate some of those things, we'll run into this problem of narrative and story, that if it's a war of attrition that lasts for 20 years, I just don't know on our side if we'll be able to sustain it. We need a sort of better story than that. We just have to arrive at that. I'm confident that we will, but it won't be easy work. And then sort of the final point one can make in terms of the Europeans is that it is disconcerting, of course, that we have still, a sort of German pragmatism, British preoccupation with internal problems, France thinking about a kind of European vision for the war, and then Eastern Europeans who are very impatient to see Ukraine triumph on the battlefield and willing to make very, very great sacrifices. So Europe is not on one page with this war, and probably as time goes by, those differences could become more emphatic and more accentuated. It's yet another reason to kind of come to some kind of conclusion about the beginning of the end in Churchillian terms. We're maybe at the end of the beginning, but we're not yet at the beginning of the end. And in a way, we have to get there. I don't even mean practically. We sort of have to get there philosophically, figure out what the end means, what we can drive for, what we can push for. And when we get there, I think a kind of complete strategy will have crystallized and come into focus. So maybe that's in terms of the public sphere and people like us who write about these things and teach them and engage with students. We have to sponsor a very rich, open-ended and creative conversation on that point, and sort of bring these ideas forward and give them as a gift to the policymakers.
Absolutely. And the Churchill quote that I used myself in my recent book is, "Now this is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end." And your point is we have to at least have some vision and begin a conversation, a story about what the beginning of the end is, if it's not the end itself.
Jeremy, you and I are both, sort of students of longstanding of George Kennan, and he comes to mind very often to me in this crisis, because what Kennan recognized in a nuclear age is that you don't get unconditional surrender. In fact, I think Kennan felt in general a lot of wars you don't get unconditional surrender. It's a sort of an unusual ending to a war, and I think we can say with confidence we're not going to end this war with Russia's unconditional surrender. So what then? Right. And maybe we have to go back to Kennan and sort of think about how he conceptualize these things and work with that, and maybe it is in the end some version of containment that's gonna make Ukraine free, and that's a tricky way to end a war, but I suspect it's a possible one.
Well, and it's perfectly Clausewitzian, right? The 19th century German theorist or Prussian theorist Karl von Clausewitz, his whole argument, right, is that war is politics by other means, and that's as true at the end of a war as it is at the beginning of a war.
Yes.
Zachary, Michael has given us really such a powerful tour d'horizon of this conflict. He's allowed us to see the domestic and the international implications in Russia and Ukraine and elsewhere. He's encapsulated so many dynamics. As a young person watching this closely, and I know you and your friends are, and many others, what do you hope for in the next few months, Zachary?
Well, I hope that, as Professor Kimmage echoed, or I would like to echo what he said, which is I think we need to make sure that we don't lose the narrative. And I would like to see in the next few months a clear understanding among the American public of why we are fighting this war. I don't think we have fully lost it yet, but I think we need to take a hard look, possibly, at our initial fervor over the war, but at the same time retain the kind of, if not optimism, at least hope that I think the last few weeks have brought.
And moral purpose as well?
Indeed, yes.
I mean, do you think the
Hope
moral
through
message?
moral purpose.
Do you think the moral message is important here?
I do think the moral message is important, and I think the advantage from a sort of narrative perspective in the United States is that I think it is clear to most, or the vast majority of American observers, who the good guy is and who the bad guy is. And I think that that's always a much easier story to tell and sell, if you will, to the public.
Michael, I want to give you the last word on that. When we first spoke in February, in the shadow of the beginnings of this terrible war, it was one of our most morally difficult conversations in more than 200 episodes on this podcast, not because we didn't know where we stood, but because of the moral crisis in front of us. And I would just love for us to close with some of your thoughts on the moral issues today and what role they play in the war.
It's hard to feel in any sense like we're out of the woods when it comes to to the moral questions for the simple reason that, as Zachary has documented in his poems, the atrocities have piled up, the war crimes have piled up. It was very, very sad to read last week the advice of the Ukrainian government for those people who are now living as refugees outside of Ukraine's borders. The advice was not to come home this winter because of all the sort of energy concerns and electricity concerns, and you sort of think of the family dynamics there and the children and all of that, and it's utterly heartbreaking. So despite all of the great battlefield successes Ukraine has had in the last couple of months, that humanitarian tragedy is one that is intensifying over time. I think that the extraordinary challenge, and it's just to echo Zachary's point, is that it's not hard for us as outside observers to come up with a moral position on this war. It's a very morally unambiguous war. It's hard to marry that moral position to the kinds of patience that this war is going to demand of us. And so in the same way that we might think about Kennan with his refusal to sign on to unconditional surrender, and the sort of, when you think of containment, one of the contributions Kennan made was that containment was a strategy for decades, not for years. I think we're going to have a kind of moral posture that's capable of lasting for decades and not just for years, because there's no doubt in my mind that Putin is going to try to outweight us and outlast us and tire us out, and count on our distraction and our return to entertainments or our preoccupations of private life and of domestic national life, and his assumption is that we just don't care that much. And that was his assumption in 2014. We care more about Ukraine. I sort of heard that phrase a lot when I was in government on the Russian side. We care more, you guys care less. To a degree, Putin was kind of right about that in 2014, but he has to be wrong about that now. He must be. We must prove him wrong on that point at the present moment. So how do we sustain support for a country? How do we sustain moral resolve when you don't get the Hollywood finish, when it's not Saving Private Ryan? That's our question, and we need a moral framework and vocabulary. So let's never forget the Second World War. It's always worth remembering, but let's not overthink the Second World War at the present moment and overthink that moment of resolution, because I think we're going to have to live without a quick or easy resolution. But at the same time, I think it was the word moral fervor that Zachary used, retain that moral fervor as we stand at the river's edge of this war.
Right. And as George Kennan said of the Cold War, and as many said it really throughout the Civil War and the long post-Civil War period in our country, it's the long struggle and the moral mission and narrative of the long struggle that's crucial.
The Civil War, I don't mean to extend the conversation too far, but the Civil War, and I haven't read your book, Jeremy, but I wonder if you would agree with this point. I think the Civil War is an excellent analogy because, as Eric Foner and other great historians have taught us, it's not like the Civil War ends in 1865. I mean, it's still, in a certain sense, ongoing in our political lives and culture, and certainly on the issue of eradicating slavery and racial prejudice and those inequalities that were one of the many reasons why the war was fought. Again, 1865, 1875, 1885, 1925, 1965. I mean, you can just see the sort of the ways in which the cause was not realized and the ideals of the war were not, sort of fully achieved, if they've even been down to the present day. So I think the Civil War is a very, very good analogy and in a way, a very sobering one.
Precisely. And back to the point you've emphasized so many times so well, Michael, the reason it's a civil war by other means is because the politics continue to matter enormously. The narrative matters as much as who's firing weapons upon whom on a battlefield.
Yes.
Michael, you have given us really an informative, provocative, stimulating, and very helpful way of understanding this enormously complex and terribly tragic moment that we're all a part of in different ways right now. And I think you've also given us a pathway forward for our listeners who care about democracy and care about their own participation in democracy to see how this history can be useful, how all of us can be part of at least the public discussion about the moral dimensions of this war and how crucial those moral dimensions are to the content of the war itself. Michael, thank you for sharing your insights and your time with us, and we hope you'll continue writing so we can continue learning from you, from your pen, as well as from your voice.
Well, these kinds of conversations are only possible in the company of a poet and of a scholar of, sort of wars, civil, cold and civil, cold and hot. So it's
the ways I like my steak, Michael.
Right. Well, better civil than cold, but or rather better hot than cold. But it's only possible because of the wonderful space that you guys create on this program. So I will very, very much look forward to the moment when it's possible to return to your company.
Well, we look forward to that as well. Thank you as well, Zachary, for your stimulating and thoughtful poem, as always. Thank you most of all to our loyal listeners for joining us for this week of This Is Democracy.
This podcast is produced by the Liberal Arts ITS Development Studio
and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin.
The music in this episode was written and recorded by Harris Codini.
Stay tuned for a new episode every week. You can find This Is Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher.
See you next time.